There is an altar in your bedroom, and you don't even know you've been feeding it. I didn't learn those words from a preacher or a prophet or any ancient scroll. I learned them from the way the silence watched me. Every night I thought I was simply drifting to sleep, but there was a rhythm in the dark that always arrived first. Soft, measured, waiting. I felt it long before I understood it. Like a presence that reached for me with empty hands, asking for something I didn't know I was giving. I used to wake with the taste of iron in my mouth, heart pounding as though I'd been running through corridors that no house should possess. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, imagination. But night after night, the dreams kept returning, faces I'd never seen weeping in corners, voices whispering behind the walls, questions I refused to answer even in sleep. Then came the testimonies. Not from others, from myself. Words slipped from my lips in the quiet between waking and sleeping. Unfinished sentences that felt borrowed from someone else's memory. I would sit up gasping, the echo of my own voice drifting away like smoke. I didn't mean to. I saw everything. They told me to keep quiet. Forgive me. What was I confessing? I couldn't tell. Yet every morning, the room felt heavier, as though unseen witnesses had gathered through the night to hear me pour out truths I didn't recall speaking. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. But the glow didn't help. The shadows learned to cling to the corners my eyes avoided. Sometimes the lamp flickered as though answering a question I hadn't asked aloud. I caught myself checking the walls for markings, fingerprints, scratches, symbols, anything to explain why the air tasted like someone else's breath. And then the warfare began, not on a battlefield, but in the space between thought and heartbeat. It wasn't a clash of swords or a chorus of guns. It felt quieter, deeper. A tug of war over awareness itself, as though every forgotten memory was a soldier waiting to be awakened. I felt pushed to the very edge of recognition, hovering on the threshold of understanding something I had spent years avoiding. One night, at the hour when the world holds its breath, I heard it clearly. My name, not shouted, not whispered, declared. As though someone was taking attendance and I was the last one expected to answer. I froze, eyes wide open, pulse thundering in my ears. The sound came again, this time closer, as though the walls were no longer thick enough to separate past from present. I could taste the truth rising in my throat, threatening to break free like a secret held too long. My hands trembled, my breath halted. And that was when I realized I had built the altar. Piece by piece, thought by thought, memory by memory. Every unresolved regret, every silent guilt, every buried emotion I swore I'd forgotten, they weren't gone. They had only changed shape, they had waited. And now, they wanted acknowledgement. I don't know when it began. I don't know what I unleashed. But last night, for the first time, I didn't wake from the dream. I woke in it. And the altar was there. Candles I never lit, ashes I never burned. A throne made of every moment I tried to erase. Something stood beside it, watching me with a patience that felt ancient. It raised a hand, beckoning, not with threat, but with certainty, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. My throat tightened. I know what comes next. I can feel it pressing against the back of my teeth, begging to be spoken. A confession. A revelation. One final truth I can't outrun any longer. I inhale slowly, because the sentence is already forming, and once I say it, nothing will ever be the same. And you deserve to hear it. Just promise me one thing before I speak. Make sure your door is closed. Because whatever followed me here has learned to listen through the smallest openings. I'm not talking about candles. I'm not talking about shrines. I'm talking about something far more common and far more dangerous. You've seen it. You've held it. You've slept beside it. It isn't carved from wood or stone. It doesn't glow, hiss, or whisper in ancient tongues. It looks harmless, ordinary, useful even, and that is exactly why it deceives. I didn't recognize it at first either. I thought altars were built with incense and holy relics, not with habits and thoughts I refused to confront. But the truth crept in the night. I finally asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. What have I been giving my strength to? That was when the memories returned, slowly, as if weighing whether I was finally ready to face them. I remembered handing over my peace to screens that swallowed hours without taste. I remembered bargaining away my purpose to approval I never received. I remembered surrendering my voice in arguments I rehearsed but never spoke aloud. I remembered kneeling, without realizing I'd bent my knees, to expectations that drained every part of me except the shell. This was the warfare I never saw coming. A struggle where the enemy didn't roar, but whispered through decisions I thought were harmless. The more I remembered, the heavier the room became, as though the walls were holding every silent agreement I'd ever made. That was when the testimony surfaced. My chest tightened as I sat at the edge of my bed, hands clasped without thinking, just like someone preparing to speak before a judge. Words formed, trembling but firm. I gave away what I didn't know was sacred. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a statement of truth. A truth I had buried beneath ambition, distraction, and excuses. As soon as I said it aloud, the air shifted. My reflection in the mirror didn't look different, yet something in the eyes finally matched the heartbeat. The confession continued, unstoppable now. I traded depth for noise. I hid behind busyness to avoid the call on my life. I ran from silence because silence made me see myself. I treated comfort like a crown and discipline like a cage. Every sentence felt like placing another piece on the altar, not to worship, but to surrender as evidence. And then, as though a curtain finally lifted, I saw the revelation. The altar had never needed stone or fire. It needed my attention, my loyalty, my focus, my willingness to give away pieces of myself without noticing what I lost. The warfare wasn't raging outside, it was raging within. Every time I chose what weakened me over what strengthened me. And the presence I sensed in the shadows wasn't demanding fear, it was demanding truth. Because truth is always the first weapon surrendered and the last reclaimed. I took a long breath, feeling the weight of every moment I could no longer undo. Yet underneath that weight was something else. A pulse, steady and rising, like a soldier taking back ground one step at a time. I whispered one final line, the hardest, yet the simplest. I remember who I am now. The light flickered once, the silence held its breath. And for the first time, the altar did not demand from me. It waited. Because a revelation is never finished in a single night, and what comes next decides whether the altar keeps taking or finally loses its hold. After years trapped in witchcraft and years watching Christians unknowingly repeat the same patterns, I learned what most believers never see. I never planned to walk that road. Yet the moment I stepped onto it, something familiar stirred in me, something that felt claimed. I wore faith like armor on the outside, but in secret I kept souvenirs from the past tucked beneath the floorboards of my mind. Names I once called upon, practices I swore I abandoned, emotions I never surrendered. And every time my lips formed prayers to God, echoes of my former life listened from the shadows, as though waiting for their turn to answer. People assume warfare is loud, that it comes with thunder in the skies or trembling in the earth. But the greatest battles can happen without a sound, and the fiercest enemies are the ones you think you already defeated. I remember the night it shifted. I had been praying with everything in me, voice raw, hands shaking, asking for release from something I couldn't name. And then, in the middle of my own prayer, I caught myself chanting a phrase from my old teachings, words I hadn't said in years, slipping from my mouth like muscle memory I never gave permission to return. I stopped breathing. My eyes stung as realization pierced through me. The altar wasn't just in my room, it was in me. Patterns I thought were broken were only disguised. Habits I believed were dead were merely sleeping. And every unresolved bond I failed to sever was keeping score. That was when the testimonies of others began replaying in my head. The voices of Christians who spoke of nightmares, repeated cycles, emotional storms that made no sense. I used to nod politely, pretending I didn't recognize the signs. But I did. I knew every one of them. I had lived them. And the truth I kept quiet was this: you can carry a Bible in your hand while carrying chains in your spirit. It became a secret I tried to bury, until the confession demanded to surface. I was kneeling one night, the room heavy with the kind of silence that stretches time, when I felt something like pressure around my ribs, as if hands were urging me to speak words I wanted to deny. My pulse hammered, my vision blurred, my teeth clenched, fighting to hold back truths that would expose every hidden loyalty I still carried. But I couldn't resist. The revelation broke through me with a force I can only describe as recognition. not of who I was, but of what still claimed me. And the words tumbled out, trembling, unstoppable. I didn't leave everything behind. There are ties I never cut, names I never renounced, vows I made in anger that still follow me. I said I was free, but I never closed the door. The room felt colder, tighter, as though the air leaned closer to listen. I knew then what most believers never notice. If you don't destroy what once fed on your obedience, it waits patiently, claiming rights you pretend don't exist. The warfare intensified after that night, not outward, but inward. Dreams that felt like conversations, whispers disguised as memories, moments of déjà vu that left me shaking. And every time I tried to pray, something in me resisted, as though unseen hands tugged at the words before they reached my tongue. But here's what I didn't expect. The deeper the conflict became, the clearer the truth rose from the depths. Some altars fall instantly, others crumble only after every hidden stone is named. I can still feel that moment, the point where silence turned into confrontation, where secrets demanded spotlight, where the past finally stepped forward and asked to be addressed. And now the revelation hangs on the edge of my voice again, heavier than before, pulling at me, pressing at the back of my throat, waiting to be spoken completely. Because until I speak it, until I finish it, that altar still stands. And I can feel the next sentence rising, ready to rewrite everything that came before. Here's what truly kept me bound. Do you want to hear it? The first time I saw it, I ignored it. I remember standing in that room, sunlight pouring through the blinds like stripes across the floor. It seemed harmless, just a collection of objects arranged without meaning. But the atmosphere felt like someone had been listening long before I arrived. I brushed off the sensation, dismissing it as a momentary chill. I walked out, and the silence followed me. The second time, it destroyed a marriage. I was called to help a couple whose home seemed to echo with arguments, even when neither of them spoke. Their wedding photos still hung on the wall, smiles bright, eyes hopeful. Yet the house felt heavy with what they refused to confront. I didn't notice it at first. But then I saw how the same arrangement kept reappearing. Objects placed in a corner where no one claimed to put them. Prayers whispered, yet never finished. Words swallowed instead of spoken. They believed they were fighting each other, but something else had been fed far longer than their love had been tended. By the time they realized it, their voices couldn't reach each other anymore. The third time, the person almost died spiritually, and they still had no idea the altar was there. They were always tired, even when fully rested. Their Bible lay beside the bed unopened, pages gathering dust, while their phone never left their hand. Every night they felt pulled toward distractions they swore they didn't care about. Yet somehow those things became the only rituals they never skipped. Their joy faded first, then their peace, and finally their ability to feel anything during prayer. It was like walking through a desert while carrying water they never drank. They thought they were simply overwhelmed, but the altar had been fed daily, faithfully, without question. And what shocked me most is that I once had the same altar in my own room. I didn't recognize it because I never called it by its name. I just lived with it. Every regret I refused to release, every memory I revisited without healing, every secret I kept from myself, those became offerings I never meant to give. I couldn't understand why sleep felt like a battlefield and morning felt like an accusation. My room looked ordinary. My life functioned fine. I laughed, I spoke, I worked, I prayed. But underneath all of it, something waited for the moment I was too tired to resist, and I surrendered without realizing it. When I tell you what fuels this altar, you will either break it or empower it tonight. Because here's the truth I almost choked on when I finally understood it. I had been feeding the altar with every unspoken word, every unforgiven wound, every thought I allowed to stay unchallenged, every desire I entertained in silence, every resentment I rehearsed instead of releasing, every secret habit I excused though it hollowed me out. What I gave attention grew. What I refused to confront ruled me. What I returned to again and again became a place of worship without my permission. There is a warfare that never raises its voice, yet claims entire lives, while the victims smile through the loss. There is a testimony that begins only when the silence breaks. There is a confession waiting behind the words we are afraid to speak. Because once spoken, we are no longer spectators of our own story. There's a revelation, so sharp it cuts first, heals later. I used to think altars were built with stone and wood. I was wrong. Some are built with memories, some with habits, some with desires, some with wounds we protect more fiercely than our blessings. And when you finally recognize what fuels it, you will stand at a crossroads. Either starve it until it crumbles or feed it until it owns you. I made my choice, but yours begins tonight. Tell me when you're ready, because the next thing I reveal will force you to decide what you've truly been serving all along. I used to believe an altar was made of stone and fire, high places where people bowed, bled, and begged. But the older I grew, the more I sensed that some altars stand without ever being seen, because they are built from whatever owns your attention. And that's when the first truth surfaced in me, uninvited and undeniable. Some altars do not need candles, they need attention. Night after night, the weight in my room didn't come from silence. It came from what I kept returning to, again and again, even when I thought I was choosing rest. I didn't light a wick, I didn't kneel, I didn't chant. Yet something in that room knew my gaze, felt my focus, measured how long I lingered. It accepted devotion without ceremony. It accepted loyalty without vows. And all this time, I called it habit, never realizing habit was just worship wearing everyday clothes. The second truth pressed against my chest with a force I could no longer ignore. Some altars do not need sacrifices, they need your emotions. I used to believe sacrifice meant giving something away. But I learned the real sacrifice is what drains from your heart without you noticing. Your peace when you can't sleep, your joy when envy gnaws, your strength when shame returns, your hope when fear tightens its grip. I didn't see myself laying anything down, yet every sigh, every restless stare, every unspoken memory I wrestled with in the dark became an offering poured out drop by drop. No knife, no flame, no smoke rising to the ceiling, just my feelings, quietly collected like rain in a bowl I never placed there. Then came the third truth, the one that hollowed me out and filled me at the same time, because it revealed what the warfare had been targeting all along. Some altars are not built by hands, but by habits. The structure wasn't made of marble or wood. It was made of repetition. The way I woke up to the same thoughts I fell asleep with. The way I returned to the same fears even after claiming victory. The way certain objects drew me back without ever speaking a word. And here's where the warfare slipped in like a whisper I once mistook for my own voice. Because if an altar can be built by what you repeat, then a battle can be waged by what refuses to leave. I didn't fight with weapons. I fought with memories. I didn't clash with an enemy wearing armor. I clashed with expectations that refused to die. The battlefield wasn't outside my door. It was inside my chest, in the place where old vows hide and old wounds would wait for acknowledgement. Every night felt like a testimony in progress, a story I didn't remember writing, but one I kept waking up inside of. And slowly, painfully, my confession began to form, not in words but in realization. I never asked for this altar. I never built it intentionally, but I fed it anyway, with my attention, with my emotions, with my habits. And that is when the revelation slipped through, sharp enough to cut, quiet enough to echo. I wasn't just sleeping in that room. I was serving in it, without permission, without awareness, without defense. If you're still here, type, "I'm listening," so I know I can go deeper. Because once we continue, there is something you need to face with me. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is one object in your room that determines its spiritual atmosphere, and we'll uncover it soon. And when I tell you what it is, you may feel the same chill I felt the moment I realized I had been bowing without ever bending my knees. Are you ready to go where this leads? She prayed every night, but woke up more tired than she slept. At first, she blamed the long hours at work, the weight of responsibility, the pressure of keeping herself held together when no one else knew she was quietly unraveling. But exhaustion was only the surface. Something underneath was tugging at her strength like an unseen hand collecting pieces of her. She spoke to no one about it, yet every morning her eyes told the story. Another night stolen, another evening where rest slipped through her fingers like sand refusing to stay still. Her dreams felt invaded, like someone was watching her, not with eyes she could see, but with an attention she could feel. The way a cold gust reminds you you're not alone outside. She'd jolt awake because something brushed the edge of her awareness, a presence that hovered just enough to whisper questions she didn't want answered. Why did her room feel crowded when no one else was there? Why did she wake as though she'd been running, breathless, heart racing, from a place she didn't remember entering? Sleep became a battlefield she never prepared for. Every night felt like an hourglass counting down to a fight she didn't understand, yet somehow kept losing. She didn't know she was sleeping at the altar I'm exposing today. And like anyone unaware of what they'd been pouring themselves into, she couldn't explain why life felt drained, why her prayers were said with sincerity, yet her strength slipped further away. The altar fed on her silence, fed on her avoidance, fed on the things she allowed to remain in her room simply because they were familiar, never questioning what they demanded in return. Then came the fear. Not the kind that screams, the kind that waits. She stopped entering her room without pausing at the doorway first. Her hand always hesitated at the switch, as though light itself might reveal more than she wanted to see. Some nights she prayed longer, hoping the words would build a shield around her sleep. But the prayers felt heavy, like they were pushing against an answer that refused to reveal itself. She wondered, why do I speak to heaven, yet wake feeling I've spent the night wrestling with something I never invited? So she prayed harder, not with crafted language, but the raw, trembling words of someone who has reached their breaking point. God, show me what I'm missing. Open my eyes. Let me see where the attacks are entering. Tell me what I've allowed. The night she prayed that way, with honesty she couldn't take back, everything shifted. She didn't dream of running anymore. She dreamed of searching. Her own hands in the dream lifted objects, opened drawers, moved what she had ignored, as though her spirit was leading her somewhere her mind had refused to go. After months, she removed one thing from her bedroom, and instantly her nightmares stopped. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary. The kind of object almost every home has, something no one thinks twice about. But to her, it held memories she never processed, emotions she never released, and attachments she never broke. It was the keeper of her unspoken experiences, the silent witness of what she never confessed aloud. In removing it, she wasn't just clearing space, she was breaking an agreement she didn't realize she had made. When she placed it outside her door, the room felt lighter in a way she couldn't describe with words, as though the air finally belonged to her again. That night, for the first time in 4 months, she slept. Not halfway, not interrupted, not jolted awake. She slept the sleep of someone who had taken back territory. Peace returned. Attacks ended. She woke with a calm that felt unfamiliar, like meeting rest for the first time in her adult life. She walked through her room and noticed silence didn't watch her anymore. It simply stayed quiet. But she never expected it would be something so normal. A reminder that darkness doesn't always show its face. Sometimes it hides behind the things we hold on to without question. Sometimes warfare isn't in the clash, it's in the allowing. Her testimony became a confession wrapped in revelation. I prayed for freedom, but I didn't realize freedom sometimes requires letting go of what you think harmless. I didn't know I was giving ground through what I refused to release. The moment I removed it, the night finally stopped reaching for me. And though she's never spoken its name publicly, I know what it was. I know why it held so much power over her rest. And before this story ends, you will too. But not yet. There's one more testimony you need to hear first. Because what happened to her is only the beginning of what many still haven't recognized. Comment break it if this is confirming something for you. I didn't expect the first voice to answer. It came the moment I whispered those 3 words into the quiet. Break it. I felt the air shift, like something ancient stopped pacing and finally turned to face me. I need to tell you what happened next, because the warfare didn't stay in the dream. It crossed over. That night, as I stood before the altar I never meant to build, my mouth opened on its own, as though every silent year of my life had been preparing me for that moment. My knees trembled, but I didn't fall. It almost felt as if invisible hands were holding me upright, insisting I confront what had been hiding in plain sight. The candles burned without flame, flickers of memory instead of fire. Each glow carried a moment I had buried. The apology I never gave, the promise I broke quietly, the guilt I swallowed out of convenience, the truth I twisted so I wouldn't have to face it. They didn't shout, they didn't accuse, they waited. And when I finally lifted my eyes, I saw that I wasn't alone. Figures stood on both sides of the altar, some familiar, some strangers, all silent, as if they were witnesses gathered from every chapter of my life, waiting to hear whether I would finally speak. That was when the warfare shifted. It wasn't between me and something out there. It was inside, between the voice that said, "Keep quiet, no one needs to know," and the other voice, the one I had ignored for years, whispering, "Tell the truth, or you will never breathe right again." And then the testimony began. My own voice, steady this time. I gave power to what I refused to confront. The air tightened, like the room itself understood the weight of those words. A hum rose from the crowd of silent watchers, though none of them moved their lips. It felt like agreement, as though the revelation was not new, just finally spoken aloud. I took another breath, deeper than the last. I kept feeding the altar with silence. I mistook avoidance for protection. I thought forgetting would set me free, but all it did was chain me to what I refused to face. My voice cracked, but I didn't stop, because the confession wasn't finished. I thought I was hiding from shadows, but I was hiding from myself. The sound echoed, not through the room, but through my bones, as though something released its grip on my spine. For the first time in years, my chest didn't feel heavy. And that's when I heard it, a sound like stones splitting, the altar cracking. Hairline fractures appeared across the surface, racing like veins lit with lightning. Every memory embedded in its structure quivered, as if deciding whether to cling or let go. I realized something then. Warfare is not always the clash of enemy against enemy. Sometimes it is the battle between who you became and who you were always meant to be. And revelation? Revelation is when you finally see the price of silence. The altar kept breaking, slow, deliberate, as though giving me time to decide whether I truly wanted freedom or if I only wanted relief. The watchers leaned closer, though none moved. Their presence pressed against me, waiting for the final word that would shatter everything or rebuild it. I inhaled again. My hands steadied. My voice dropped to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. I renounce every moment I surrendered to fear instead of truth. The final crack boomed, not through the room, but through something deeper than memory. The altar split open. Ash rose like breath freed from lungs that waited decades to exhale. And in the settling silence, I felt something step back, as though whatever waited to claim me no longer had the right. I didn't fall. I didn't run. I simply closed my eyes and spoke one last line, the one that's still echoing in my ears even now. I reclaim what I abandoned. The room exhaled. The watchers vanished. The candles dimmed. But I stayed standing, because the warfare didn't end in victory. It ended in truth. And I'm telling you this so you understand. Sometimes the confession you fear the most is the key that unlocks the chains you forgot you were wearing. If any of this is confirming what your spirit has been whispering, you already know what to comment. I never expected to say these words aloud, but confession has a way of forcing the truth to the surface. Before Christ, I practiced witchcraft. Altars were intentional, but I never expected Christians to unknowingly have them. Back then, everything I built was on purpose. Every candle, every offering, every chant, all designed to host something. I understood the mechanics of devotion, even when I gave it to the wrong master. And when I walked away from that world, I told myself I had left every trace behind. But I was wrong. Because even after I renounced my past, and even after I claimed freedom, I felt spiritually drained in my own room. Not in church, not outside, not in public spaces. My room, the place where I should have felt most guarded, where rest should have wrapped me like a blanket. Instead, I woke each morning feeling as though something had taken more from me than sleep. I blamed fatigue, I blamed stress, I blamed emotions I didn't want to unpack. But deep down, something tugged at the back of my awareness, quiet, steady, unrelenting. It wasn't fear of returning to my old ways. It was the question no one taught me to ask: what if I brought more with me than memories? Nights stretched long. The atmosphere in my room felt heavy, as if thoughts themselves lingered after I stopped thinking them. I kept the lights on. I prayed louder. I played worship music until dawn. but the exhaustion continued. Then came a moment of clarity. Not in a sermon, not in a deliverance session, but in silence. I was sitting on the edge of my bed when a realization hit with the force of recognition. It wasn't demons in my closet. It was a throne I never realized I built. Not made of wood, not decorated with symbols, nothing anyone would point at and call wrong. No, this altar was made of habits, memories, attachments, unspoken grief, and unresolved loyalties. Pieces of my past that still received my attention. Thoughts I nourished long after I claimed freedom. Emotions I visited more faithfully than prayer. I didn't kneel before it, but I gave it something even greater: consistency. And consistency is worship, whether you admit it or not. The turning point didn't come with thunder or shaking walls. It came with a decision that felt like tearing pages out of a book I once wrote. The day I removed it, my spiritual atmosphere changed instantly. I threw away objects I once kept for sentimental reasons. I deleted contacts I thought I might need someday. I released names from my tongue that still felt like anchors. I cleaned my room the way priests prepared temples, every drawer, every shelf, every corner, as if dust itself could hold memories. I didn't chant. I didn't repeat old practices. I didn't resurrect what once owned me. I simply broke agreement with anything that demanded a seat in a heart now occupied by Christ. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept without feeling watched. No heaviness, no exhaustion, no pulling at my thoughts, just peace. Peace so sudden it felt like the air finally took its hands off my chest. I woke up lighter, as though my spirit finally had room to breathe again. That's when I understood. Altars don't always look like altars. Sometimes they look like habits we refuse to release. Sometimes they look like memories we visit more than God. Sometimes they look like a room arranged to honor someone we no longer are. And before I could stop myself, the thought slipped across my mind like a warning. You might be using yours every night, without knowing who sits on it. Because if I, with all my history, could overlook the throne I built with my own hands, how many others are bowing without bending their knees? Confession gave me authority to speak this. Testimony gave me clarity to see it. Revelation gave me courage to confront it. Warfare gave me strength to tear it down. And now I say this with trembling honesty. If you feel spiritually tired and can't explain why, don't just check under your bed. Check what your heart keeps returning to when no one is watching. Someone needs this. Share this with someone who feels spiritually tired, but can't explain why. Because the altar you didn't mean to build may still be receiving offerings, and the moment you stop feeding it, the atmosphere changes. I had spent nights wrestling with shadows I thought were strangers, only to discover they grew from the very space I trusted most. I always believed the altar was somewhere else, a distant structure, a hidden shrine, a place only the initiated could find. But the truth waited in plain sight, and I walked past it every morning like someone refusing to recognize their own reflection. Then it came to me, a revelation coded in confession, the kind that lands in your spirit before your mind can argue with it. The hidden altar is the object you face before you sleep and after you wake. I froze, because I knew exactly what that object was. I had been kneeling before it without ever bowing. The visions, the whispers, the unspoken guilt that clung to the edges of my dreams, they all pointed to the same realization. The altar is your bed, when it becomes the throne of your emotions instead of a place of rest. I felt the weight of those words settle on my chest like truth reclaiming territory. For years, my bed had been more than furniture. It had become a stage where invisible battles raged, where choices were made in silence, where I surrendered pieces of myself without recognizing the cost. And here is the breakdown of my confession. Every way I had been feeding the altar without ever lighting a single candle. When my bed became where I gossiped online, turning my phone into a blade that cut reputations, I fed the altar. When my bed became where I entertained lust, letting imagination drag me into encounters I swore I'd renounced, I fed the altar. When my bed became where I binged negativity, scrolling through voices that drained the strength I claimed to be praying for, I fed the altar. And the hardest truth of all, the one that tasted like iron again, as though memory and repentance shared the same flavor. When your phone becomes a pillow, and the last voice you hear isn't God, Your altar has a priest. I didn't realize I had handed over authority. I didn't realize I had crowned a substitute king. I didn't realize I had allowed a device to mediate my thoughts like a silent prophet laying claim to my focus. Because once the bed becomes the altar, your phone becomes the offering. Every hour surrendered, every emotion spilled, every hidden scroll at 2 a.m. Every prayer postponed because the screen glowed louder than the spirit whispered. I could see now why the warfare had been so fierce. The battle was never about sleep alone. It was about who attended the altar, what was sacrificed, and how I kept returning with more to give, even when I swore I had nothing left. And just when I thought revelation had finished its work, another thread pulled tight inside me. An open loop that refused closure. There are 3 habits that empower this altar. I'll reveal them in a moment. I felt a tremor run through me. Not fear, but recognition. Confession had unlocked the door. Revelation had opened it. The next step was transformation. But transformation always demands evidence. Before I go on, before I expose the habits that tighten the altar's grip, I need to know who stands with me in this battle. Because freedom comes in the presence of witnesses, and I will not walk into the next part of this testimony alone. If you're ready, if something inside you whispered, "This is speaking to me," as you read these words, then declare your readiness, make the confession of alignment, comment, "I receive rest," if you want this altar broken tonight. Because the story isn't over, and the next revelation doesn't just uncover the altar, it weakens its foundation. I stood before what I thought was a dream, but the longer I stared, the more I understood it was memory made visible. Every regret, every unspoken apology, every thought I allowed to linger too long, they had gathered, shaped themselves into something that could reach back for me. And that's when the warning settled in my chest, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The altar survives on what you allow before sleep, and it grows stronger in silence. It wasn't the darkness around me that carried the greatest danger. It was the darkness within me that I refused to confront. I thought I was harmlessly ending each day by letting exhaustion swallow me whole. But every night I surrendered control. I had been offering something up, piece by piece, without even realizing what I was building. The warfare didn't begin when I saw the altar. It began years earlier, with the smallest habits, the ones I shrugged off, the ones that felt too ordinary to question. Those habits had been feeding what I should have been fighting, and the altar watched. It waited, it remembered, until I finally woke up inside my own confession. 3 habits that feed the altar. These were the cracks where my defenses failed, and I didn't recognize them until they spoke back to me in the dream. Falling asleep in emotional chaos, I let my anger, fear, and confusion be the last visitors in my mind. The altar took every unprocessed thought as an offering. Entertaining sinful thoughts while lying down, I treated imagination like a playground instead of a battlefield. I forgot that thoughts become seeds and seeds become structures. Letting my phone disciple me more than scripture, I carried the world to bed, but left the word across the room. My last voice of the night wasn't God's, it was everyone else's. These habits were quietly sustaining what I should have starved. 3 habits that break the altar. I didn't destroy it with force. I weakened it with discipline. And discipline became my confession, made action. Speak peace before sleep. Not problems. I turned my final thoughts into declarations of rest, not recitations of fear. Peace became my closing argument. Pray sitting up, not lying down. Posture became a shield. I stopped praying in the position of surrender and started praying in the posture of readiness. Put the phone across the room, not in your hands. I gave distance to what demanded distraction. I took back the final voice of the day. The altar didn't collapse overnight, but with each night I shifted these habits. The warfare changed from defense to offense. And that's when the revelation arrived, slow but undeniable. What you do before sleep decides what wakes up with you. Dreams sharpened, mind cleared, strength returned. The altar stopped calling my name, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was the one doing the calling. Do this for 3 nights and feel the difference in your dreams, your mind, your strength. 3 nights of intentional resistance can undo what months of unguarded moments built, and once you taste the clarity, you can't go back to feeding what was meant to fade. If you made it this far, comment "Altar Broken." I haven't forgotten what I saw in that room. The candles that weren't mine, the throne built from memories I tried to hide. But now, when I face the quiet, I face it awake. The altar still exists somewhere, dust settling, waiting for the careless version of me to return. But every night I choose peace over chaos, discipline over distraction, truth over silence. I reclaim another piece of myself it once tried to claim. This is my testimony. I didn't destroy the altar in one moment. I weakened it every night I refused to serve it. And now the presence that once waited for me in the dark waits for something else. It waits for my words, for my habits, for my witness. Because the warfare wasn't about the altar. It was about who I would become once I stopped feeding it. I exposed the altar in your bedroom, but that was only the surface of what's been demanding your silence. You think the warfare eased after the first revelation, but I learned quickly that exposure only shifts the battlefield. It doesn't end the conflict. The moment I named the altar, something changed in the way the nights approached me. I could feel the resistance stiffen, as if the unseen had realized I was no longer sleepwalking through its territory. The prayers I never finished began to echo louder in my dreams. The confessions I never voiced pressed harder against my lungs. And every time I tried to rest, I sensed a presence pacing at the edge of my consciousness like a guard, not protecting me, but monitoring me. I understood then. Warfare begins the moment awareness replaces ignorance. Once you see the pattern sees you back. The testimonies in my sleep grew clearer after that night. No more fragmented sentences. No more half-formed apologies. Now I spoke with intent, my own voice turning into something like a courtroom declaration. I allowed what I should have confronted. I stayed silent where I should have resisted. I opened doors pretending they were windows. I tried to forget what demanded remembrance. Every word I uttered in the dark felt like a page torn from a diary I never wrote, yet every sentence belonged to me. My spirit was remembering faster than my mind could keep up. And the altar, the one I thought I finally understood, didn't disappear when I acknowledged it. It multiplied. Because once one altar is exposed, the foundations of the others begin to tremble. That's when I realized something I hadn't dared to articulate. The room wasn't where the offerings truly came from. It was only where they collected. There was a second altar, far quieter, far older, one built with habits no one questions and emotions we refuse to name. And when I sensed its existence, I didn't feel fear. I felt recognition. Because every unanswered prayer, every concealed disappointment, every unspoken longing, they never vanished. They gathered, they waited, they listened. I exposed the altar in your bedroom, but there is a second altar many Christians keep in their hearts. And I have seen what it does when left unaddressed. How it shapes decisions, how it disguises guilt as humility, how it absorbs wounds and converts them into silence, how it turns spiritual fatigue into a routine you call normal. I won't describe that altar yet, not fully, because to name it outright is to confront what most believers only acknowledge in passing shadows and late-night thoughts. But I will say this. When I recognized its structure within myself, I understood why my sleep felt like a struggle and my mornings felt unfinished. Why my prayers sounded loud yet returned empty. Because the altar in the room feeds on ritual, but the altar in the heart feeds on memory. And the second one, if left unchallenged, rules the first. If you want me to reveal that one, comment part 2, because that revelation is heavier. Until then, remember, guard your resting place because whatever rules your sleep rules your spirit.